Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live. My name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I'm the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain, the Blended Podcast, and founder of the Blended Pledge. And I am so excited to partner with Reveal to bring you one last discussion together in 2024. Now, Let's Talk Supply Chain and the team at Reveal have collaborated on a lot of incredible content this year with interviews, case studies, explorations around using technology to save money and drive parcel efficiency. And we're rounding out the year with everything you need to know to prepare yourself for a strong 2025. Now, I'm going to be joined once again by Josh Dunham and for the first time by Jack McCrum. And don't forget, if you have any questions for Josh and Jack during today's live, go ahead and comment and we'll answer as many questions as we can. Now, you already know that managing parcel shipping expenses has a direct impact on your bottom line, and that managing those expenses effectively is not easy. And just when you think you've got a handle on your strategy and control of your costs, in comes a general rate increase to upset the balance once again. And this year's increase brings some additional changes with it just to keep you on your toes. So we're taking a closer look at what the increases by the two biggest carriers, FedEx and UPS, mean for shippers in 2025. We'll be exploring the shift from annual to continuous increases and the changing carrier strategies driving it. We'll be revealing the businesses hit the hardest by these increases and the impact shippers can expect. And we'll be shining a light on why the published 5.9% rate isn't as positive as it might look. So let's bring up our guests for today. We've got Josh and Jack. Welcome to the show. It's great to see you.
Good to see you as well. Thank you.
Awesome. So let's get started. We've got a lot to talk about today. There's some challenges, there's some positives, there's just a lot that people need to know. And so, Josh, starting with you, why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, and just a little bit about Reveal?
Yeah, so I am CEO, co-founder of Reveal, and Reveal is ultimately a data and analytics firm in the parcel spend management space. So really what we do is we help companies leverage data to make better decisions, to become more efficient and ultimately save money in the parcel shipping space.
And who doesn't want that these days? Right? We're looking at all sorts of things to try to keep those costs in line. All right, Jack, why don't you tell everybody who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Sarah. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jack McCrum, and I am the Director of Optimization and Analytics team here at Reveal. So my role, I am responsible for supporting customers in maximizing the value of their carrier agreements via data analyses, strategic projects, and really just general advisement. I'm also very much a data geek, and when it comes to the types of industry changes that we'll be discussing today, I'm extremely excited. So I've been in the industry space for about just under 10 years, primarily working in consulting, where I've advised customers of really all sizes. So really a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm really excited to dive in.
Yeah, we love data geeks here at Let's Talk Supply Chain, and we want to dive a little bit deeper into that and get to know what data we need to know for, going into 2025. All right, for anybody who is listening and watching, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Where are you tuning in from? Put that in the comments. And remember, we're going to be taking questions all session long. So let's dive in. We've seen a fundamental shift in the way FedEx and UPS are increasing their rates. So Jack, I want to start with you. Can you talk to us about that shift from annual to continual? And what are some of the costs that are making up these continuous increases?
Certainly. I think that's a great place to start, Sarah. Really, within the last 5 years, what we've seen from FedEx and UPS is this transition away from relying on the annual rate increases, the GRIs, that we're going to be talking in more in depth today, to this more fluid pricing strategy of rolling out kind of these continuous adjustments. And you want to think about it in terms of pulling levers. So carriers have started focusing on updates to items like fuel surcharge tables, zip code reclassifications for delivery area surcharges, and an ever-changing list of demand charges. And this really makes it harder for shippers to plan their budget as the increases happen incrementally and often really without any fanfare or a single announcement to shippers. So it's really quite interesting to see this within the last 5 years.
But also, who has time for that? I mean, I don't know about you. I've talked to a lot of chief supply chain officers and supply chain professionals, and if we've got ongoing increases, I just don't know how we're going to manage all of that. So, Josh, why have FedEx and UPS shifted to this approach? I mean, you've said in Reveal's GRI report that this shift is both surprising, not surprising, all at the same time. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, really what the shift symbolizes is a change in the carrier strategies. And ultimately, it really does allow the carriers to adjust pricing dynamically. So they can now respond better to fluctuating costs, market demands, capacity constraints that they have. And I would say ultimately, yes, it was surprising and not surprising in regard to the increases. Surprising in that what we saw in the increases when we modeled it is that the increases actually more or less were a lot closer to the announced 5.9% than in years past. But where we weren't really surprised is when you look at some of the mid-year and ongoing kind of like Jack described fluid or dynamic increases, they actually did in fact mirror more of what we would expect from an annual rate increase.
Yeah, it just seems a little bit crazy to me that we're going to be seeing this across the board a lot more frequently, right? I think that's got to be one of the surprising parts of it, especially for shippers who have to manage this or their teams have to manage it as well. Josh?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very, very difficult. I mean, really, when you look at it, it's like these changes require, a lot more analysis, requires, like you said, it's like, who has time, to look at these changes? Who has time to monitor that you're being charged, correctly? And quite honestly, without tools, it almost makes it impossible to do so.
Well, and just keeping on top of the information, right? We can send out the information and say, hey, this is happening right now. But sometimes you can't get to it right away. And that's going to compound if it's happening on a regular cadence throughout the year. At least with once a year, you can sort of keep on top of it. You know what time of year it's coming out. So it'll be interesting to see whether this really is in the best interest and how people react to it. Now, Jack, how are carriers using these incremental increases like fuel surcharges, updated zip code rules to raise costs? Because this is a much more subtle approach, right?
Yeah, Sarah, subtle is certainly one word for it. I'm sure there's quite a few others that shippers can use. But really, when we start looking
It's a
at
nice word.
it's a very nice word. But carriers are really focusing on things like fuel surcharges and zip codes because at the end of the day, very few contracts really offer that protection against changes in the definitions themselves. So the practical effect is, for example, if I have a 25% discount on fuel, I did a great job in my last negotiation, and my new year starts at, say, $4. Well, by changing that fuel table and increasing that basis point, all of a sudden my discount as a shipper is much less effective by the end of the year. And I use fuel as a great example because this is something that we saw UPS update 3 times in 2024. Three times they went back to the drawing board and said, you know what? Fuel prices are declining, but we're going to increase that fuel pricing just a little bit here, really to help improve our profitability. And they're very open about this if you listen to their earnings calls. So these changes are often, very subtle is the word that you use, but they're cumulative, right? They're resulting in really significant and immediate increases over time, rather than this one-time announcement that we see at the start of every year.
Right. So you're getting a rollout of it throughout the year rather than one time throughout the year. I mean, being in logistics, I used to be in operations, and I remember fuel surcharge being one of those charges that came in, went out, came in, went out. Like it was really just very difficult on trying to figure out when there was an additional fuel surcharge, et cetera, et cetera. And that was on ocean freight, that was on air freight. This is on parcel. And so it feels like they're going the exact same route or somewhat of a similar route to the ocean freight and the air freight carriers. So Josh, why do you think these changes make tracking and managing shipping costs more complex for shippers? I mean, I just gave one example of what I went through in operations as a freight forwarder, having to deal with fuel surcharge and things like that. I can only imagine what this is going to do for parcel.
Yeah, I mean, it makes it extremely complex, and really, when rates change dynamically, I mean, it really requires shippers to really monitor the rates and the surcharges in real time, and that becomes extremely difficult. And quite honestly, I mean, without tools, I mean, it's really easy to miss these incremental, adjustments or tweaks, changes, and ultimately, it's going to lead to higher expenses, to the bottom
Yeah.
line. I mean, that's where it leads to.
Well, and also, how do you pivot to that, right? Because at the end of the day, you're going to have an incremental rate increase throughout the year. And so you may have to pivot with some of the charges. And if you actually charge for shipping on your website, sorry, all of these things are sort of coming to me. As a retailer, if you're charging shipping on your website, you're going to have to continually sort of update that as well, which is a lot of work from the tech and IT side, potentially.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. A ton of work on that side, a ton of work monitoring it. It's going to throw off kind of these set models, I would say, that companies have, because now
Yeah.
these models need to adjust almost in real time. And they need to adjust dynamically to coincide with the carrier changes. So it makes it a lot more difficult from a shipper's perspective.
Yeah, and how do you do that with sort of, marketing and rolling out promotions and things like that? I mean, it's going to actually we can't be siloed in this approach. It's actually going to affect a lot of the departments internally that are going to have to come together and sort of change the way that they think, or maybe the timing of some of these things that they do as well.
Absolutely. Yep. You're absolutely right.
All right. So with that, let's talk about what this all means for businesses. I mean, we've just talked about a couple of things that came to my mind while we were talking about the incremental increase model that they're looking to change to. But Jack, can you talk to us about how that published rate increase of 5.9% now will translate into real world cost impact for shippers? And I'm assuming that incremental rate increase is going to go into effect for 2025. So it's 5.9% right now as a GRI, but then they're going to roll out this new model for 2025. Is that right?
Yeah. So, Sarah, I mean, 5.9%, I think the first and most important thing is just to say that it's a bit of a red herring.
Mm,
It looks great in marketing. It's very succinct. It's something that carriers and shippers can really, lock onto. But it's a bit more complex than that. And Josh, I think, has done a great job so far of talking about the complexity of this. But 5.9% is really an aggregated average across really all aspects of just the transportation pricing. Doesn't even include the accessorials, and we'll talk about that in a second here. But
huh.
some aspects of pricing with zones and weights are higher, and some are going to be lower. So the real world impact is often much higher for shippers because each shipper and their profile is different, and they have unique exposure to different aspects of the cost increase.
Hmm.
So when you have FedEx and UPS coming out and saying we're increasing everything by about 5.9%, yeah, that looks great, but they know exactly what's driving their profitability, and those are the areas that they're really hitting hard going into their pricing. So just on its face, 5.9% is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. And that doesn't even get into kind of, as I mentioned, the accessorials. When you bolt on things like fuel surcharge, the delivery area surcharges that we kind of touched on briefly, and even things like additional handling, where we're seeing year-over-year increases of almost 30%. We see a lot of potential for shippers to pay an increase closer to 10% or more, really depending on what the nature of their profile is and what they're shipping out. So 5.9%, it's a great starting point, but that's just it. It's just the starting point.
That's just the baseline. And I think
Yeah.
people can expect, a little bit higher than that, almost closer to 10%. Now, before I go to Josh, I want to say hi to Ravati over on my personal LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us. She's joining us from Boston, Massachusetts. And I want to let everybody know in the comments, we've put the GRI guide in there. So if you have, go and check that out. If you have any comments or questions for us throughout the show, make sure to put it in the comments so that we can get to that a little bit later. All right, Josh. So what are some of the biggest impacts and challenges then? Like, what should we be looking out for? What's the full scope of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge for shippers is truly understanding, how does the increase affect me? Like Jack said, every shipper has a unique profile, and the 5.9% is just an average.
Yeah.
So when you actually have to dissect the increase and overlay the increase on your profile to understand how it's going to affect you as an individual shipper. And that's an extremely difficult thing to do without robust tools.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it just how do you and that's one of the things I've been thinking about throughout our throughout the discussion so far is how do we manage that? How do we make this easier? What does that look like? And so Jack, I'm going to go back to you. I mean, the real world increases that will be incurred by shippers are actually relatively close to the published rates of 5.9%, which we've talked about. That hasn't necessarily happened for a number of years from the research that we've done for this show. But that's where the nuance of the shift from annual to continuous increases make a difference. This is kind of what I was alluding to earlier. Can you talk about how those earlier increases are actually making the full financial impact for shippers? What does that mean? So 5.9% today. Are we looking at like another increase in Q1, another one Q2, Q3? What do we have to brace ourselves for?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Sarah. Let's just dissect that question real quick. I mean, the 5.9% and how close our macro analysis came to that really threw us for a loop. We spent a lot of time analyzing if it was truly holding water, and this year is kind of unique. We see both carriers, FedEx and UPS, when applying their GRIs across all of our customer base, ending up somewhat close to those 5.9%. So it gets back to kind of this continuous pricing that we discussed earlier. So when carriers implement those frequent smaller increases, it spreads the financial impact over time. And DAS is a great example. That's the delivery area surcharge, especially this year, because when we actually saw the GRI remain relatively flat year over year, that doesn't include changes to, what zip codes is that GRI being applied to. So while the actual percent increase remains flat, the number of areas it's being applied to is increasing over time. And this year, the big surprise was, it's no longer just being applied to rural areas. It's starting to be applied to metro areas. And so that on its face changes how we even talk about delivery area surcharges with our customer base and how the industry views them. So as we kind of project forward, I think towards the back half of your question here, as we start thinking about this in 2025 and beyond, I think shippers really need to start preparing themselves for what is most likely to be adjusted in terms of the definition. What is something that is really not showing up in contracts, so there's something that you really don't have negotiations or discounts on, and that tends to be the definitions. So I think we're going to get a lot more cowbell. I think carriers are really going to be focusing on getting large packages out of their network. They're going to be focused on expanding those delivery area surcharge applications, the number of zip codes. And starting to really reassess how that fuel is being applied in addition to the demand surcharges. So, there's a lot of different areas that the carriers can go with this. It really is kind of up to the carriers themselves. We just have to kind of be readily monitoring it, to Josh's point, and just be ready.
Yeah, and really understanding what those accessorial charges are that could spike throughout the year as well. And so, Josh, why do shippers need to know about this? Like, why is understanding these changes, the hidden fees, the surcharges, the zone specific heights? I mean, there's there's so many things to think about and keep on top of and understand where these increases could actually potentially affect everybody. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, being aware of the fees, the surcharges, the zone specific hikes, like you mentioned, I mean, it really allows shippers to become more proactive. So when you think, if you're unaware that these things are occurring, I mean, and we work with a ton of different shippers out there, and I would say the majority, prior to us working with them, are in a very reactive mode, right? They react to what the shippers are doing, and they react to what the P&L says at the end of the quarter, but oftentimes these are delayed. And when you are in a state of reaction, as opposed to, proactively looking at these things, you miss forecasts, you miss budgets, and ultimately, you're going to be grossly overpaying.
Yeah, and nobody wants that. I mean, let's be honest. There's a lot of disruptions happening in supply chain. We definitely don't want this as being a surprise. Now, before we go on to the next part of our conversation, I want to give a shout out to Juan. He is joining us on my personal LinkedIn from Barcelona. Great to see you. I see some questions coming in the comments. Keep those coming. We're going to get to those a little bit later in the conversation. Now, the reality is that what sits behind these rate increases, increased changes is shifting carrier strategies, which is kind of what we talked a little bit about before, right? They're thinking about how do we do these increases a little bit differently? What do our counterparts do? Maybe on the ocean freight and the air freight side, what does that look like? What are shippers used to? What do they want to see? So, Josh, what have FedEx and UPS's strategies been previously? How are they changing? What's the focus of these new strategies so that we can sort of wrap our heads around it as professionals going into 2025?
Yeah. So previously we obviously saw them just rely on typically one big increase per year. And I say big, 5.9, kind of on average, right? And that was kind of the focus. So it was an annual increase. And what we've seen them do over the last, several years also is really lean into maximizing revenue through surcharges, right?
Mm-hmm.
That has been an evolving strategy that we've seen. That is still a focus for them. So I think we're still going to continue to see the annual rate increase, be very, very prevalent. We're still going to see them lean into surcharges, but we're also going to see them, focus on this dynamic pricing, right? Where things change kind of mid-year or throughout the year. A couple of the other things that we have seen them doing in regard to a change in strategy is they're beginning to show shippers and tell shippers through their pricing, what products they want, and maybe more importantly, they do not want within their networks, right?
Okay.
So what we have seen is maximizing or a focus on maximizing revenue through premium services.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen, some of the higher weight breaks are really, they focus on higher weight breaks, higher zones, so things like that. So we're really beginning, like I said, to see, okay, the carriers are telling us what they do not want in our networks. I've either got to think about different modalities of shipping, right? LTL, freight, but the message is very, very clear in their increases.
Well, and so that kind of brings us to the next question is how is this going to impact shippers? I mean, if I'm a furniture shipper, right, is that the type of shipment that UPS and FedEx want? Maybe not because it's big and bulky, right? But it's really going to show us if that's the kind of cargo, or do they have to shift what they're doing and take a look at LTL, but also that's going to increase delivery times to their customer, which then affects customer retention, et cetera, et cetera. So much to think about. So Jack, talk to us about how these strategies are going to impact shippers. What are they pushing shippers towards?
Yeah, Sarah, I think you hit the nail right on the head there. Listening to these earnings calls, one subject consistently kind of rises to the top, and that is the focus on revenue quality. It is driving both UPS and FedEx at this point, and it's really driving, as Josh mentioned, what kind of carriers do they want in their networks. So what we're seeing, I mean, if you take large package surcharges, for example, those have doubled over the last 5 years.
Wow.
And so furniture companies, and those aren't inexpensive charges. 5 years ago, it was $120 published rate. Today it's either $240 or $300, depending on your carrier for those charges. It's just outrageous. And so what we're seeing is kind of, we're seeing the open encouragement to kind of take their larger packages elsewhere, free up, truck space for their delivery vehicles. We're also just seeing it kind of subtly through this pricing with additional handling charges, large package surcharges, overmax, oversize, what have you, to really usher these types of shipping volumes out the door. And it is going to go somewhere like LTL or a larger niche carrier that is focusing on the large and bulky.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that even goes for like flat pack, but like dimensional weight as well. You're going to see where that shift is probably going to go as well. So I guess my next question for you, Jack, is like, who's going to be hit the hardest by some of these changes?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Sarah. Really, what we've been trying to do is identify what are the characteristics that are going to expose shippers to these charges and who's going to be most impacted. Number one is going to be the smaller businesses out there, shippers that lack shipping volume to negotiate more favorable rates. they're always a little bit susceptible to these rate increases, but especially as we kind of look into, those who utilize express services, they're just automatically just shifted towards kind of the top of most impact. We also see, those shippers that, as you called out, kind of a furniture shipper out there, e-commerce.
Yeah.
I think of like a Wayfair, for example. Those are going to be shippers that are just more at risk because of their exposure to these heavier package weights and their exposure to these additional costs as well. And lastly, again, shippers that have a lot of delivery area surcharge exposure, shipping across the country to more rural areas, we're starting to see the carriers push back on the delivery to those areas in certain areas, again, by a similar pricing increase metric. So there's a lot of different ways you can slice this in terms of what business the carriers want and they don't. I think what it comes down to is a narrowing of the ideal customer profile.
Yeah. And like, that's not really great news for small businesses, right? Small businesses get hit really hard in a variety of different ways. This is kind of the last one they need because, last mile delivering to that consumer can set them apart from their competitor and also, make them a competitor in their space as well. So that's really hard to hear. I don't like to hear any of that. But also, it's going to also make supply chain teams think about packaging, the materials that they're using, right? Is the material really heavy? And are they getting dinged because of that material? Can they use another lightweight, maybe more sustainable material for their actual product? So again, when we talk about the impact internally, right, we talk about marketing and promotions and being able to deliver to the consumer and what that looks like, or maybe even updating the shipping price on the website. But it also even goes further than that and further upstream for sourcing and buying and taking a look at raw materials and packaging as well.
Absolutely.
So one of the hardest things for teams is that they're wearing so many hats. I think I've mentioned this a few times. There's so much to do, never enough time. And so shippers aren't easily able to get to the bottom of the changes, ultimately meaning they could end up paying more and leaving themselves open to bigger business impacts. So Reveal are really trying to help with that. Josh, can you talk to us about your 2025 GRI rate guide and what's inside? We've just released that in the comments. So go and check that out now. But we want to give you a bit of a preview as to what you're going to get when you download that rate guide. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, we're really excited about what we produced this year. I mean, we've done this for a number of years, but this year, Jack and his team got really, really involved. Our design team got really involved this year, and I think just simply stated, knocked it out of the park. I mean, this thing is awesome. It's really comprehensive. You're going to see FedEx, UPS changes. They're going to be broken down. You're going to be able to visualize where the increases are occurring most. Maybe it's by the specific service or the zone or even the weights. You're going to be seeing exactly where some of the hidden fees are, the surcharge increases, the zip code updates, things of that nature. And it's really going to help shippers. And like you said, Sarah, I mean, it takes something that is very, very complex and it just makes it so intuitively simple to understand. So we're once again extremely proud of the team for what they created this year.
And that's what we all want. We just want to make it as simple as possible. Sometimes we get overwhelmed with the complexities that are just sort of thrown at us for no reason. So I'm glad to hear that you were able to bring it into a simple term. If you're over on my personal LinkedIn, we'll be updating it with that link at the end of this show. So stay tuned. Jack, how does the guide help shippers to identify opportunities when it comes to optimizing shipping profiles, mitigating costs, improving service delivery? Like, give me the tea on this guide.
Yeah, Sarah, there's a lot of great content that we tried to bake in, and I think Josh hit on the key points here. Number one, it arms shippers with information detailing exactly where those points of cost increase are arising. So what we do is we kind of reverse engineer that 5.9%, and we give shippers the information to understand, okay, how is that 5.9% really coming across all of my zones, weights, and services? And most importantly, how is it going to impact me? We also provide actionable insights for really shippers to align their shipping strategies with the new rate dynamics. So, what do I do with this information is always top of mind when we're looking at new increases, the rate guide is a great place to start thinking about those next steps that you can take and identify really these cost savings opportunities that we see kind of top of mind for operational improvement, as well as a number of other areas. So it really just provides clarity in terms of what steps can you as a shipper take to really take that information and run with it in 2025.
Yeah, and I love actionable takeaways. I mean, I think everybody loves that because they just want to know where to start, right? Where do I start? What do I need to look at? What does that look like? And so, Josh, I want to ask you for some actionable takeaways today. What are some of the practical steps that shippers can take to align their operations with the new rate dynamics?
First and foremost, you have to understand your data. You've got to understand it. You've got to be able to use it to your advantage. You need to know exactly where you're taking the largest cost increases, year over year or even mid-year. And then next, once you're equipped with the data, then you can now engage in proactive conversations with your carrier rep. Right. And what we have seen and experienced and what our customers have experienced and told us is that the carrier reps are very receptive to having conversations about this, right? And very receptive to helping, find solutions. But if you can't go to them armed with data and armed with knowledge, then you're not going to be able to have proactive conversations with them. You're just not going to be able to. Oftentimes we get asked, what leverage do I really have, with my carriers? I can change my volume to another carrier. Yeah, you can do all of those things. I honestly, truly believe that the biggest leverage point shippers have is your knowledge of your shipping profile. And the only way that you can really know your shipping profile is through the data. And I would say lastly, if you don't have the ability to see your data, dissect your data, you have to get tools, to be able to do that. Especially moving into the future. You need tools we have an analytics hub, internally that really helps you, see expenses at a completely different level, monitor them in real time, things like that. You can even drill down to the individual product and or SKU level. I know, Sarah, you mentioned furniture shippers, being, highly hit. You're absolutely right. I just think of one small example. We had a furniture customer of ours, and they had no idea, but they had a new product come up. And when we provided some of the SKU level analysis for them, they realized that as a result of the changing carrier surcharges, one of their items was no longer profitable to ship. Now, they had no idea without this analysis. I mean, really just no clue, right? But until we showed them, they were like, oh my gosh. And then what they had the ability to do, though, was stop shipping that item and make it in-store only. So they actually had to change their operational strategy there.
That's so smart. I mean, I've also heard from a couple of our conversations just around packaging too. It's just a very small thing that could make such a difference. But that's a really great example of, having something available to be shipped and be purchased online versus putting it in the store. And it could be that's driving it, but also some retailers want to get people in their store. And so that's a really great way to do that as well. So when we talk about internal collaboration, I like all of this because the data isn't just to communicate to the carriers. The data can also provide a lot of great insights to a lot of the different departments that need to now work together to figure out what it is to ensure that their supply chain, their last mile delivery is as efficient and optimized as possible. And you can't do that without tools. You can't do that without the data. We talk about data a lot. And so I feel like we should all have our data houses in order, but there's so much data. I mean, how do we even do that? But it's tools like these that can really help us do that. Now, we are close to getting to questions from the audience. So make sure you put your questions into the comments. Mike, I see your question. We're going to get to yours in just a minute because we've got a lot to talk about. We've got a few more in the comments that I want to get to as well, but we've got a little bit more to cover. I hope you are all enjoying this conversation. If you are, put an emoji in the comments too. We want to just make sure that you're listening and you're enjoying the conversation. So when it comes to managing these rate increases and leveraging your guide to, make informed, proactive decisions which is what we all want. Nobody wants to be reactive. We've talked about how you also need the right tools. And it's tough to say after so many years of talking about digitalization, but there's plenty of organizations out there that still don't have the right tools, maybe have their data in order. So Jack, talk to us about why traditional tools like spreadsheets or outdated digital platforms are falling short when it comes to addressing these continual rate increases. I mean, I can think of just one, and I use this all the time. What version are we on? 48, 52, and am I updating the right one? Like, what does that even look like?
No, that's a fantastic question, Sarah, and it pains me a little bit because I grew up learning Excel. I love Excel, and it's a wonderful tool.
Who doesn't?
But exactly, what we're seeing though is with this explosion of data and the requirements of integration. Josh gave a great example of tying in SKU to your invoice detail, and just basic practices of good digital management. They're quickly making items like Excel just inefficient to be able to handle this explosion of data. They tend to be a little bit slower, clunkier. You mentioned which version am I on? It's very difficult to keep up with just the constant flood of information coming your way. And so, if you break it down, what does it actually mean to handle this? Handling these continuous rate changes is something that's better suited to a software solution digitally connected to those updates.
Mhm.
Being able to track and manage your own timesheets, it's time consuming. You're prone to error, all of us, and it's really not equipped to kind of the dynamic direction that we're seeing these carriers take. And so what we're seeing is a much heavier reliance on digital data and the needs of our customers to kind of rely on something more than traditional spreadsheets or
Mhm.
tools.
Well, and I go back to something that I read just a little while ago. I think it was Formula One. This is from a procurement side, but they were trying to manage 1 million parts on a spreadsheet. I mean, this is kind of the
Oh,
same
wow.
thing. How many zip codes do you have? How many lanes? How many different SKUs, with different sizes that you have to manage? And then put on top of that the rate increases that are going to come fast and furious, it looks like in 2025. Like, I could only imagine where the mistakes are going to lie and how much money is going to be left on the table. So, Josh, what do businesses need to be better equipped? Like, how can Reveal help them to make smarter, faster decisions? What does this really mean for shippers?
I mean, ultimately, shippers need more modern tools. They need data-driven platforms. We're really, really excited about kind of where technology is going and some of the more innovative technology that we have now at our disposal, because we've been able to take our parcel spend management 2.0 platform and incorporate things like AI and machine learning into them, right? And really, what that allows shippers to do is it allows them to get real-time data. It allows them to get actionable insights, so things that I can actually take action on and tangibly do, to become more efficient, save money, things of that nature. But our tool allows them to be predictive, proactive. They can run, kind of modeling scenarios. They can do forecasting.
Simulation?
Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
simulation. All in all, I mean, you have a parcel landscape that is evolving and it's constantly changing, and you have to have modern tools to keep up with the
Mhm.
changes there.
Yeah, I like the simulation point. I mean, going back to the packaging or tweaking a material, the example that you just said, if we can simulate what that looks like, if we're thinking about making a change or changing a zip code or whatever that looks like, if we can simulate that, take the data back to the team and have an intelligent conversation about what that change is actually going to do. And there's never a perfect decision, but it's like, where do you want to spend the risk dollars? Where do we want to have risk? Where do we want to spend more money? And maybe it means that you do want to spend the more money, but at least ahead of time, and it's not something that you're catching 6 months down the road, and you've already shipped out some of these products, and you're like, oh no, wait a second, we should have put that in store 6 months ago and saved us a whole bunch of money. So I just want to give a shout out to Rick. We have put the comment with the GRI guide in the comments on LinkedIn for you. So go and check that out right now. We heard your question, and we want to make sure that we get that out to you. So Josh, I have one final question before we get to the audience questions, and then I'm going to come back to you both and sort of ask you one final question. So as we look into 2025 and beyond, with these complex changes in mind, how important is it to adopt a proactive, technology-driven approach? I mean, this is kind of a funny question, right? Because I think everybody needs to be on board at this point, but there's a lot of people that aren't. So talk to us a little bit about that. And what do they risk by not being on board?
Yeah, I mean, as you look into 2025, it's essential, for businesses to really adopt a data-driven approach. I mean, you have to at this point. And our approach, like internally just at Reveal, has always been, we want to lead through innovation, right? We want to take advantage of, the new tools and technology that is at our disposal. And ultimately, that's what our customers asked us to create. Technology is absolutely paramount to allowing businesses to navigate this complex parcel landscape. I mean, parcel's arguably the most complex in any modality of shipping, right? And when you look ahead, the companies that are going to succeed, and really not only succeed, but thrive, going into next year and beyond, it's going to be those that leverage technology. And it's going to be, those that, because of technology, can remain agile, they can stay competitive and ultimately in control. And they're the ones that are going to win market share.
Well, and make those collaborative internal decisions, because again, it doesn't just affect one department, it affects the whole organization. And we don't necessarily realize it in the moment of making that decision if we aren't accumulating the right data. And Michael, I just had him up on the screen, said the carriers are using data, so should their customers. And isn't that just the truth? All right, let's get to some audience questions right now. So Mike says, any insight on yet to be announced UPS, LPS, and AHC? And maybe Jack, you can break that down for us because I don't know either of those terms. Updated definitions effective on or after January 27th, 2025. Jack, what do you think?
Yeah, Mike, first off, thank you for the question. It's a great question at this point in time. For those of you who are kind of trying to dissect the lingo there, UPS announced, in addition to their surcharge announcements, that they're updating their definitions of large package surcharges, LPS, and additional handling charges as well. And what they're doing is they're focusing on the dimensional changes and moving away from kind of the length plus girth to something more cubic and dynamic nature. So, Mike, long answer short there. I'm still trying to figure out what they're meaning by that. We really don't have too much insight there, but I would say I can guess at the outcome, and that's going to be more expensive for shippers. We've seen these changes in the past when these were first introduced, and it definitely caught a lot of people off guard. So, what that looks like, what that materializes in, we're certainly keeping an eye on, but we don't really have an indication yet.
Well, and I think the other answer to that is to connect with Jack on LinkedIn, and, he'll let you know once he knows more, right?
Absolutely.
All right. We've got another question from Amy. What do you predict for GRIs in the next 5 to 10 years, and how can businesses prepare for long-term trends? What a great question. We've been talking about like now till the end of 2025. But Josh, you have a crystal ball. I know you do. I'm not sure where it is and whether it's within reach. But if you could use your crystal ball, what would you predict?
I mean, ultimately, it seems as though the carriers are pretty anchored in having an annual rate increase, right? So I don't think we're going to see them get away from that, anytime soon. I think that's going to remain kind of constant. So you're going to continue to get the annual increase, but what you are going to see is this move to this more dynamic pricing model, right? To where the carriers can really, dynamically change pricing based on, availability, within the capacity of their networks. They can kind of drive, changes and or needed packages or volume through the network. So that's really what we're going to see. I also think we're going to continue to see these mid-year increases. We're going to continue to see, changes to fuel tables, changes to, the DAS zip codes. Those aren't going to go anywhere either.
That was such a great question. We've got another one from Jeremy. It looks like, what tools or resources can businesses use to negotiate better carrier contracts in light of the GRI? I mean, this is a big question every single year, right? How do we maybe not accept the GRI and push back a little bit and figure out our negotiating power on how we can bring that down? Josh, did you want to answer this one?
Yeah, I mean, we have a really cool tool within our application, and it actually analyzes based on your unique profile, how the GRI affects you. And it'll actually run a model based on a year's worth of your data, and it will transpose the new rates on this model. And you can see by service level, weight break, specific surcharge, exactly where you're going to take the increase going into next year and exactly how much. And then how can you negotiate, better contracts with your carriers as a result of that is now you can have more educated, better conversations with your carrier rep. Now you can come to your carrier rep and say, I know my residential surcharge is going to increase by 8%. I need help in this area. I know my additional handling is going to increase 23%. I really need help in that area. So now you can see by having the data broken down very granularly, it makes you and the carrier have better conversations. And that's really what it's all about.
Well, and think about how you're going to feel walking into that. I mean, Josh, you just portrayed that with such excitement and such passion. And if you're armed with that data, I feel like everybody else can feel that way walking into a conversation with the carrier, which you couldn't have said previous
Right.
to having the right data and the tools to be able to negotiate and have that conversation. So for all of you supply chain parcel data geeks out there, I mean, just think about, how you're going to walk into that conversation now that you've got the right tools and the right data. I love that. You're just giving confidence, right?
Absolutely.
You're literally just handing people confidence in going into those conversations. And
absolutely. Please don't approach those conversations and go to your rep and say, I just need better rates. That's not a successful formula there.
Even with a smile on your face and like passion behind it, that's not going to work.
They'll be smiling back.
They'll be like, sure. Okay. What have you got for me? All right. We've got another question from Heather. What role do surcharges and dynamic pricing play in carriers' overall revenue strategies? That's a good question. Who wants to take that? Jack, do you want to take that one?
That's a good question. Sure, I can take that one, Sarah.
Sure.
Long and short of it, these surcharges are coming up more and more in the earnings calls as kind of boosters to that revenue quality that we were talking about previously. And so I think that's a really good indication of the mindset of UPS and FedEx right now, is that they are using these to kind of help bridge the profit gap that they're losing on things like capacity, which they've announced previously, the declines in volume, which we've seen anecdotally over the last few years. They're using these surcharges as a way to kind of make themselves whole in light of everything else going on in the world at any given point in time. And so I think the spotlight on surcharges and their importance as we go forward cannot be understated enough. It's critical to their strategy. They're starting to be more open about that strategy. And I would just encourage you, if you have not done so recently, listen to one of those calls. And I think it sheds a lot of light on the headspace that the carriers are in at this point in time.
How do you get onto one of those calls? I mean, is it like, an email that they send out to everybody? Here's the Zoom link. Can anybody do it?
Yes. So they have publicly shared. Yeah, anybody. They'll usually announce. I usually put a reminder in my calendar every year or every quarter, and I'll sign in when I can.
Okay. And you just go to the carrier direct, or do you get an email from them, or how does that work?
No. So if you look at investors, go to UPS investors data quarterly meeting. It'll usually populate. Pretend you're a shareholder, sign in, and not pretend you're a shareholder. You don't have to pretend you're a shareholder, but sign in and just listen. It's very insightful. It's very interesting.
Okay. Those are really great resources, especially if you want to, gain some insight into how they're thinking about it, what's sort of coming up on their agenda, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I appreciate you for that. We've got one more question from the audience. If you're in the audience right now, you have any questions, now's the time to put it into the comments so that we can get to those for you. Last but not least, Raul says, what are the first steps businesses should take to understand how the GRI affects their shipping costs? Josh, you want to take that one, or Jack?
I could take it that. I mean, one of the things that we do for our customers is we run proof of concepts, and we have no problem, loading data and providing an analysis based on the GRI and how it's going to impact you. I mean, as a next step, run to the website, revealgroup.com. You can sign up for free on our site, and we can run the analysis for you. Just load some data and run it for you and give you the insights there. I think that's probably the best next step to really understanding the impact.
And it sounds pretty easy.
Extremely easy. Yeah.
I mean, that's the key point, right? We've been talking about subtle, simple. I think easy is the next piece that we want to make sure that everybody knows about. All right. So we've had some really great questions from the audience today. We'll also be tagging the Reveal team over on LinkedIn to make sure that if you have any other questions, you want to put that into the comments later, that they can come back and answer those for you. Now, I have one last question for each one of you. I'd like the audience to walk away with sort of one actionable step or something that they can think about from this conversation going into the next weeks of the end of 2024. What do we need to be thinking about, talking about, putting into action as supply chain leaders, as supply chain professionals? So Jack, I'm going to start with you. What's one thing that you would like people to walk away sort of thinking about or putting into action?
Yeah, absolutely. My universal recommendation at the beginning of every year is start with your profile. Understand, what is my shipping pattern? What did it look like last year? What do I expect it to look like this year? And base it on your data itself. It's insightful. It gives you kind of the areas of importance, and it arms you with the tools to kind of create a plan and plan forward throughout the year. Do I need to start my negotiation, my RFP process? Do I need to renegotiate this term, or this term? Data is always the best place to start in these conversations and in planning processes.
Well, I think it'll also drive how you go to internally, the other leaders internally, to let them know what
Absolutely.
potential impacts are down the road for all of you, right? All of you internally, and how do you collaborate?
Yeah.
All right, Josh, last but not least, what's the one thing?
Well, I mean, we're knee deep in this, internally ourselves. I mean, we're finalizing budgets and forecasts, for next year. And I would say the same for businesses is, really, as you start thinking about next year, budget for tools, that can help you, going into next year. I would also say, make sure you get the budget and the forecast right on your expenses going into next year. I can't tell you how many shippers reach out to us at the end of Q1. And I think it's like the first time they realize, oh my gosh, we were way off on our forecast or our budget for shipping, and we need to figure this out. We need to get more control under this. So don't wait until the end of Q1. You're in a complete reactive, kind of mode at that point. Like, get a handle on this stuff before, put it in the budget, get a tool for next year that can really help you. With the tools, you can get the budget right now. So, I mean, you can get your forecast on the shipping expense done now, and we can provide that for you.
And what you're going to save, so you can put that towards the technology. I mean, think about that conversation that you're going to be having with the C-suite or the chief revenue officer. I can save us this by getting this tool. I mean, it's a win-win for everybody. I have one last question before we go, because Ravati over on my personal says, what is the industry tool used for the simulations? Can you talk a little bit about that part of the Reveal platform?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have multiple simulations that we can run, but ultimately, the industry tool, I mean, it's in the Reveal app. And we have a tool that ultimately can do and provide a package level analysis to where we have the ability to model an entire package, kind of a data set that you give us, and you can run it, monthly, you can run it, for a year, and ultimately can run a bunch of different simulations, a bunch of different models just based on what you're looking for. So if you're looking for GRI, you have the ability to see that. If you're looking for, gosh, I want to know, what if I was to negotiate, better discounts? How would that impact my costs? You have the ability to do that. You have the ability to run carrier agreements side by side and actually simulate, how much savings is in each carrier agreement. So you can run a number of different scenarios and models, but we do, and I think it's important to note, we don't rely on averages. We rely on very specific granular package level detail to where we'll remodel fuel charges, dimensional charges, you name it.
Yeah, and you've done a really good job from all of the conversations that we've had of taking customer feedback and what it is that the customer really wants. So you're very focused on the shipper, what they need, the information, and that all comes from customer feedback, right?
It absolutely does. Yeah. I mean, our development strategy is agile for a reason. And that reason is because we have a customer advisory board. We are constantly interviewing them, constantly interviewing prospects. And our methodology when it comes to development is understand what is the job and or the problem that needs, solved. We go to our customers and get validation. And then rather than just build it, we actually build a prototype. And then we start testing that with our customers and say, does this actually solve the problem? Do you like the UI? Do you like the experience that you get, within the prototype? And once we validate that this is the solution they're looking for, then we put it into production.
I love to hear that. Thank you so much for giving us that breakdown. Well, that brings us to the end of today's live. Josh, Jack, thank you so much for joining me. With my background in logistics, I remember all too well the challenges of understanding carrier rates and agreements and hidden charges. It can be a bit of a minefield for already stretched teams. So it's great to see Reveal doing the hard work, analyzing the changes and what they mean for shippers, and then sharing that with the industry, making it really accessible and giving them the tools they need to not only minimize impact, but also maximize opportunity. So make sure to go and download Reveal's 2025 GRI guide. The link is in the comments, or visit revealgroup.com now to gain a deeper understanding of rate changes and to explore how data-driven tools can transform your shipping operations. And while you're at it, why not take advantage of a free demo to check out Reveal's platform in action? A big thank you to all of you for listening, watching, and commenting. I will see you all again soon. Thanks again to Josh and Jack and the team at Reveal.